It was a rainy Tuesday morning in May of 1999 when Evelyn Hart walked into St. Agatha's Children's Hospital in Cincinnati and never walked back out. The clouds hung low over the city, thick with spring thunder, and the streets shimmered under a steady drizzle. Most people were still in bed when Evelyn, 36 years old, pulled into the hospital parking lot just before sunrise. She parked in her usual spot, third row from the front, facing the rose garden that lined the side of the pediatric wing. She stepped out of her car, umbrella in one hand, coffee in the other, and disappeared through the hospital's staff entrance. That was the last time anyone saw her. By all accounts, Evelyn Hart was the type of doctor every hospital dreamed of having. She had been working at St. Agatha's for nearly a decade, dedicating her life to children who were often fighting for theirs. Parents adored her. Nurses respected her. The kids, many of whom faced leukemia and rare autoimmune disorders, simply called her Dr. Evie. She brought them toys, sang to them during chemo treatments, and once even organized a pajama parade through the hallway to cheer up a young girl who had lost her hair and confidence at the same time. Evelyn's presence in the hospital was like a soft light. Always there, never demanding attention, but impossible not to feel. So when she didn't show up for the morning rounds, people noticed. Her shift officially started at 7 a.m., and she was never late. At 7:30, the head nurse called her pager. No response. At 8 o'clock, they tried her office phone, then her cell. By 10 o'clock, someone walked out to the parking lot. And there it was, her car, locked, with her umbrella lying on the passenger seat, still damp from the morning rain. Security reviewed the camera footage. Evelyn was seen entering the staff locker room at 6:47 a.m., signing her name on the shift log, and putting her belongings in her locker. But there was no footage of her ever leaving the building. Not from the front-back staff exit, or even the emergency stairwells. It was like she had vanished into thin air inside the walls of a children's hospital. The first theory was logical but hollow. Maybe she had walked out a side door and something happened to the cameras. Maybe she'd had a mental breakdown and simply walked away from her life. Maybe she'd gotten into someone's car unnoticed. Maybe. But the more they investigated, the fewer explanations made sense. Her locker still had her wallet inside. Her phone was later found under her office chair. Her white coat was hanging where she always left it. And her last patient file, belonging to a 9-year-old boy named Mason, was still open on her desk. The notes stopped mid-sentence. The police were called in. They questioned every staff member on duty that day, reviewed blueprints, and brought in search dogs. But St. Agatha's wasn't a large hospital. It had 4 floors, 1 basement level, and only a few access points that weren't already covered by cameras. After a 72-hour search, authorities had to make a difficult statement to the press. We have no indication of foul play, no signs of forced entry or exit, and no known motive for Dr. Hart's disappearance. The case remains open, but behind closed doors, no one believed she had simply left. Her colleagues couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened inside the hospital, something hidden. Nurses began sharing strange stories in whispers. One night nurse said she had heard a scream echo through the stairwell the night Evelyn disappeared, but security dismissed it as a hallucination from exhaustion. Another said she'd seen an old maintenance hatch near the archives room slightly ajar, a hatch no one had used in decades. But when police checked, it was sealed shut. Rumors grew. Some said Evelyn had discovered something she wasn't supposed to. Others believed a patient's parent had been stalking her, though no such individual was ever identified. Over time, people moved on. New staff replaced old. Mason, the boy whose file she was reviewing, survived and eventually left the hospital. Her office was cleared, her locker emptied. The case became a cold one, filed in a drawer with too many others that had no answers. But her memory never faded. Every year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, the hospital held a candlelight vigil in the chapel. Her mother attended every time until her passing in 2011. Some nurses, even long after retirement, said they could still feel her presence when walking past room 302, the last place she was scheduled to visit before she vanished. For 23 years, there were no updates, no clues, no confessions. Evelyn Hart's name became a ghost in the hospital's history. A plaque was placed near the rose garden in her honor. And still, the question haunted everyone. How does a person disappear from inside a hospital? And why? When Dr. Evelyn Hart failed to answer her phone that morning, no one immediately panicked. People assumed she was just busy with patients, maybe caught up in a consultation, or had stepped into a procedure. But as the hours dragged on and she missed her scheduled rounds, worry turned into something else, fear. By late afternoon, her supervisor placed a call to her emergency contact. No response. Then they tried her personal cell. It rang and rang, until eventually it went to voicemail. That was when they called the police. A missing persons report was filed within hours, and by that evening, officers arrived at Dr. Hart's downtown apartment with a warrant. Her neighbors described her as polite, quiet, and private. She lived alone in a modest second-floor unit, a 10-minute drive from the hospital. Nothing about her home suggested distress. Her keys were on the counter, her phone charger still plugged in by the bed. A half-finished cup of coffee sat in the sink, and her cat, Juniper, had been recently fed. Her calendar was marked with appointments, including a dinner scheduled with her mother the following Friday. The only thing missing was Evelyn. No sign of forced entry. No unusual activity on her credit cards. No withdrawn money. Her car hadn't moved. And most unsettling of all, nothing appeared packed. If she had intended to run away, she hadn't taken a single personal item. Not even a jacket. It had rained that morning, and her favorite coat was still hanging by the door. The hospital, meanwhile, was in a quiet state of panic. St. Agatha's had seen its share of medical emergencies, but never a disappearance. An internal investigation was launched. Meeting after meeting was held. Staff were instructed not to speak to the press. Floor supervisors retraced Evelyn's steps that morning. All they could confirm was that she had entered the building at 6:47 a.m., signed the shift log, and been seen by a nurse briefly outside the pediatric wing. And then, nothing. What made things more difficult was the building itself. St. Agatha's Children's Hospital had a long history, and with that came complications. Parts of the building dated back to the 1930s, and although the exterior had undergone recent renovations, the internal structure was still a labyrinth of old corridors, staircases, and hidden service areas. To make matters worse, there had been ongoing construction at the time of her disappearance. The East Wing was undergoing upgrades, and several storage rooms and stairwells had been temporarily blocked off or rerouted. One of the stairwells near the pediatric floor had been sealed for asbestos removal. Another led down to the sub-basement, a place many staff didn't even realize existed. Security cameras were installed in common areas, but the older parts of the hospital, particularly those affected by construction, had no coverage. That included several hallways near the archives, the laundry service area, and an entire wing that hadn't seen patient use in over a decade. The police brought in dogs to search the property. Maintenance blueprints were reviewed. Cadaver dogs sniffed through unused rooms, storage closets, and maintenance shafts. Every broom closet and crawl space was inspected. Nothing, not a single hair, drop of blood, or trace of Evelyn. She had quite literally vanished inside the hospital. As weeks passed, Evelyn's face became a fixture in local news reports. Her smiling photo, the one with her in a white coat and stethoscope, appeared in newspapers and on community bulletin boards. Missing doctor from St. Agatha's. the headlines read. Her family gave tearful interviews, begging the public for help. A hotline was opened for tips. Psychics called in with vague visions. A truck driver from Kentucky claimed to have seen someone matching her description at a rest stop, but nothing came of it. Several hospital staff were quietly interviewed, including one janitor who had quit the week after she vanished, citing emotional stress. He had nothing to offer but speculation. Soon, the public's attention moved on. A new scandal, a fresh tragedy. And just like that, Evelyn Hart's case faded from the spotlight. After 2 months, the flyers began to curl in the rain and fall from the poles they'd been stapled to. Parents peeled her photo off the hospital doors so their children wouldn't ask too many questions. Her name was entered into the National Missing Persons Database, and the file was marked inactive, pending new leads. The hospital never officially declared her deceased, but by the end of the summer, her office was cleared. Her patients were reassigned. Her name was removed from the staff list. In the records, Evelyn Hart became a line of text, a file in a cabinet, a question no one could answer. But among the nurses and residents who had worked alongside her, her memory lingered. They spoke of her in low voices during overnight shifts. Some refused to use her old office, believing it felt colder than the rest of the floor. Others swore they still saw her light flicker on at night, despite the room being sealed. She was gone, yes, but forgotten? Not even close. Over the years, theories spread like wildfire, twisting and evolving with every whisper down the hospital corridors and every click on late-night internet forums. The mystery of Dr. Evelyn Hart's disappearance wasn't just another cold case. It became a ghost story, a legend. To the public, it was a curiosity, one of those unsolved headlines that resurfaces every few years in podcasts or anniversary specials. But to the staff at St. Agatha's and the families who had trusted Dr. Hart with their children's lives, it was a wound that had never healed. At first, many people clung to the simplest explanation, that she had chosen to vanish. That maybe the pressure of working in pediatric medicine, dealing with suffering day after day, had broken her. That she'd taken cash, left her ID behind, and slipped away into some new life. A cabin in the woods, a new name in a distant town. The idea made her mother cry. Evelyn would never have left Juniper, her beloved cat, or walked away from her patients without a word, or caused her family such grief. Her best friend insisted Evelyn had been planning a summer trip with her, had even picked out hiking shoes 2 days before vanishing. Nothing about that said escape. Still, people speculated, because when answers are scarce, theories multiply. Others believed something more sinister had occurred, that she had been murdered. Maybe it was someone on the inside, a jealous colleague, a patient's angry parent, a staff member hiding a dangerous secret. The lack of camera footage, the gaps in hospital security, and the outdated floor plans only fueled suspicion. Then there were the darker rumors, the ones whispered by night shift nurses and interns on overnight rounds. Whispers of secret affairs, of medical malpractice that someone didn't want exposed. There was even talk of an underground group that had once operated from the hospital's forgotten wings, trading experimental treatments for unapproved data. All pure speculation, all unproven, but chilling enough to linger. The most persistent and eerie story came from a janitor named Alan Travers. He had worked at the hospital for nearly 10 years. Quiet man, always on time. He quit abruptly just 2 weeks after Evelyn vanished, leaving behind a cryptic resignation letter that only added to the mystery. In interviews years later, Alan shared something unsettling. He said he had been cleaning near the east stairwell that morning in May 1999, near the old service elevator. That he saw Evelyn enter, heading toward the pediatric archives. He waved. She nodded. Then she disappeared into the hallway. He followed her path later, out of curiosity. But as he passed near the blocked sub-basement stairs, he said he heard something, whispering, and not just one voice. A few, all low, murmuring things he couldn't quite make out. Alan admitted he was a skeptic. He didn't believe in ghosts, but something about that morning unnerved him. He felt watched, cold, and when he checked the basement door, it was slightly ajar, though maintenance logs claimed it had been welded shut due to safety hazards. He slammed the door closed, told no one, not until years later. When asked why he left the hospital, Alan's response was simple. Something was still down there, and I didn't want to find out what. People wrote off his story as nonsense, paranormal fanfiction, trauma-induced rambling. After all, it was a hospital, a place full of fear, hope, and heartbreak. Strange feelings weren't unusual in such a place. But not everyone dismissed him. A few staff members, especially those who had worked the overnight shifts, admitted feeling strange things in that part of the hospital. They talked about lights flickering for no reason, distant footsteps echoing when the halls were empty, doors that closed without wind. One nurse swore she heard someone crying behind a sealed storage room, only to find it empty. Still, nothing came of it. The hospital continued operating. Floors were remodeled. New staff came. Old rumors faded. Until 2022. That year, St. Agatha's was due for a major infrastructure overhaul. After nearly 90 years of continuous operation, the administration finally approved the budget to update the oldest wings, including the abandoned East Wing and its adjoining sub-basement. It had sat untouched since the early 2000s, used occasionally for storing unused furniture and boxes of files, but otherwise sealed. Over the decades, it had gathered dust, rusted pipes, and layers of darkness that no one had dared to clean thoroughly. When the contractors arrived, they were told to be cautious. The floor was unstable in areas. Blueprints were inconsistent. They started with the easy tasks, removing debris, cutting power to dead circuits, mapping the underground corridors. On the fourth day, one of the electricians noticed something odd behind a crumbling concrete panel near the sub-basement stairwell. A faint metal edge protruded from the wall. A door. Not just any door. A reinforced door sealed with bolts, painted the same shade as the wall around it. It wasn't on any blueprint. Maintenance staff had no record of it. It took them 3 hours to get it open. Behind it was a room, a small, soundproofed chamber, and inside that chamber were items that hadn't been touched in 23 years. A white lab coat, a stethoscope, a medical ID badge, and beneath a sheet of plastic, bones. Human remains. The contractors called the police immediately. Forensics arrived within the hour. The discovery made front-page news within a day. The remains were sent for DNA testing. While the world waited for answers, everyone already knew who it was. Dr. Evelyn Hart had finally been found. But the real question wasn't just where she had gone. It was why she had been there, and who had put her there in the first place. In late 2022, after years of planning and delays, St. Agatha's Children's Hospital finally moved forward with a long-anticipated renovation project. The hospital had served the Cincinnati community for nearly a century, and much of the older East Wing had been unused and falling into disrepair. Hospital administrators announced that the entire East Wing, shuttered since the early 2000s, would be torn down and replaced with a state-of-the-art pediatric surgical center. It was supposed to be a symbol of progress, healing, a fresh start for a new generation of patients. But that wasn't all the project would uncover. Construction crews arrived in early November. Their task was to strip the lower levels of the wing before demolition. Most of it went according to plan. Rusted plumbing, moldy drywall, forgotten wheelchairs. Nothing unexpected. Nothing more than what you'd expect from a decades-old facility. Until day 7, A team working in the basement encountered something strange. Behind a row of collapsing storage shelves, tucked away at the farthest end of the hallway, they discovered a bricked-over wall. It wasn't on the blueprints. None of the crew supervisors were aware of its existence. But one thing was clear. The wall had been sealed intentionally. Old cement. Crude masonry work. Someone at some point wanted to close it off and make sure no one looked behind it again. Naturally, they assumed it was just an old storage area, maybe a forgotten janitor's closet or maintenance crawlspace. With permission from the foreman, the team began carefully chipping away at the bricks. The process was slow. Dust filled the air, and behind the final layer of bricks, they uncovered something none of them were prepared for. A steel door. It was locked, rusted shut at the hinges, and covered in layers of grime. But unlike everything else in the building, the door looked different, stronger, more secure, industrial, almost like it was built to keep something inside. Curious, and with the green light from the hospital board, they began working to pry it open. It took nearly an hour, several tools, and a lot of effort. When the door finally gave way, it creaked open slowly, revealing the inside of a room that hadn't been touched in what felt like forever. What they found inside made every single person step back in stunned silence. It wasn't just a room. It was a hidden chamber. The air was thick with dust, the kind that dances in beams of light, swirling like ghosts in the quiet. The room was small, maybe 10 by 10 feet. No windows, just one flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling by a rusted chain, barely illuminating the space. Scattered across the floor were stacks of old medical files, most of them yellowed and warped by time. Some had fallen open, pages stained with moisture, names of patients long gone, procedures that hadn't been used in years. There were charts written by hand in faded ink, and in the far corner of the room stood a rusted hospital bed, the kind with thick metal rails and cracked wheels. A single stained mattress still clung to the frame, sagging from age. At first, it looked empty, but as the dust settled and the workers adjusted their eyes to the gloom, someone noticed a shape slumped beside the bed. A body, or what was left of one. There, curled on the floor, was a human skeleton. The bones were brittle and partially collapsed from years of decay. Tattered fabric clung to the remains, a faded white lab coat, eaten away by time but still recognizable in form. A few feet away lay a pair of worn shoes, one still tied. But the object that silenced the room was the name tag. It had fallen onto the floor, half covered in dust. The plastic was cracked, the lettering barely visible. But one name was still readable: Dr. Evelyn Hart. For a moment, no one moved. The construction crew stared at the scene like they had stepped into a horror movie. Some backed out of the room. Others stood frozen, trying to make sense of what they were looking at. The police were called immediately. Within hours, the basement was sealed off, and crime scene investigators began their work. Forensics confirmed the remains were human. Further testing, along with dental records, would later verify what everyone had already begun to suspect. It was her. After 23 years of theories, rumors, and desperate hope, Dr. Evelyn Hart had finally been found. The media swarmed the hospital once news of the discovery broke. Reporters camped outside. Former colleagues were contacted. Some wept during interviews. Others admitted they had always believed something terrible had happened. But no one, not even the oldest members of the hospital staff, could explain why or how she ended up sealed in that hidden room. Investigators examined everything: the files, the room's construction, who had access to the building at the time. But there was no obvious answer. Some believed it was a cover-up, that someone with knowledge of the hospital layout had intentionally trapped her there. Maybe she had discovered something she wasn't supposed to. Maybe she was lured. Or maybe she hid there, trying to escape someone, and was accidentally left behind. But one thing was undeniable. The room had been sealed from the outside, and that meant someone knew. Someone made the choice to close that wall, lock that door, and bury the truth beneath concrete and silence. Dr. Hart's family held a memorial weeks later. They never got justice, but they got closure. And for the thousands who had followed her story for more than 2 decades, it was the ending no one saw coming, but one they'd never forget. Sometimes the truth stays buried, and sometimes it's hidden just behind the wall we never thought to check. The room had no windows, no natural light, no warmth, just 4 concrete walls that had absorbed decades of silence, and one rusted metal door that had been locked tight from the outside. As investigators stepped deeper into the space, they noted the suffocating stillness. The air was dry and stale, as if it hadn't moved in years. There was no working ventilation system, no airflow, only a narrow metal air vent high on the back wall, barely wide enough for a child's hand to fit through, let alone let in a proper breeze. And even that vent was clogged with dust, cobwebs, and what looked like crumpled paper fragments too faded to read. Forensic teams examined the remains carefully and respectfully. Dental records, cross-checked against hospital employment files, confirmed what many had already feared. The skeleton belonged to Dr. Evelyn Hart. Her lab coat had disintegrated in some areas, but the badge, the buttons, even the name tag were still mostly intact. It was her. But what chilled the forensic team more than anything else were the details around her final moments. Hints left behind like breadcrumbs scattered through the room. On the inside of the heavy metal door, just beneath the peeling paint and rust, they discovered something faint. Scratch marks. Small, desperate, repeated. The kind of marks left by someone using their fingernails, or maybe a pen or a key. Not a tool. Not something strong. Just what they had. As they ran their gloved hands across the surface, they realized it wasn't just 1 or 2 scratches. There were dozens, some in small arcs, some long, jagged lines, all pointing to one thing. She had been awake. She had been alive when the door closed, and she had tried to get out. Investigators stood in silence for a long moment, processing the weight of that revelation. There was no bathroom in the room, no food, no water, just a hospital bed, old patient files, and broken furniture. No indication that this space had been used for anything legitimate in years. And yet, this is where she was left to die. Near the remains, tucked inside the inner lining of Evelyn's coat pocket, they discovered something else. A small black leather-bound notebook, warped by moisture and time. The first few pages were blank, too badly damaged to read. But deeper inside were handwritten notes, dozens of them, some barely legible, some scribbled with shaking hands. The first readable page was dated May 18, 1999, 2 days after Evelyn had disappeared. In large, panicked handwriting, it read, "They locked me in. I heard them outside, but no one came." The handwriting was messy, not like the careful cursive of a doctor, but the hurried scrawl of someone fighting to stay calm. The words tilted sharply across the page, like she was writing while sitting on the floor or curled against a wall. The next few entries were sporadic. Some mentioned banging on the door. Some talked about trying to stay awake. One entry, dated May 20th, read, "No light. No food. I think it's been 2 days. I keep hearing voices outside. Footsteps, but they never answer when I scream." The ink became fainter as the entries went on. One page had a single word written over and over again. Why? Then silence. For blank pages. Until the final entry, written in shaking letters at the bottom corner of the last page. Hard to read through the smudges, barely enough pressure left in the pen. It said, "They've stopped talking. I think I'm alone now. There was no signature, no farewell, just finality. The notebook was handed over to authorities, who treated it as evidence. Experts were brought in to preserve the fragile pages. Investigators tried to lift fingerprints, but time and moisture had erased nearly everything. Still, what Evelyn had written was enough to point to something sinister. This wasn't an accident. She had been locked in intentionally. She had survived for at least 2, maybe 3 days, if not longer, before the darkness finally silenced her. Whether from dehydration, starvation, or the sheer isolation, it didn't matter. What mattered was that someone knew she was there, and someone chose not to help her. In the days that followed, questions flooded the media. Who had access to the old wing in 1999? Why wasn't the area searched more thoroughly? Who bricked up the hallway? Why wasn't it on the official floor plans? Theories once again swirled. Some believed it was an inside job, that someone on staff had lured Evelyn down to the sub-basement. Others thought it might have been retaliation. Maybe she had uncovered something dark, like mistreatment or malpractice, and someone wanted her silence. A few even pointed to that old janitor who had quit suddenly after her disappearance. But his whereabouts were never confirmed, and no further leads surfaced. The hospital issued a statement of condolence and pledged to name part of the new surgery wing after Dr. Evelyn Hart. But many saw that as too little, too late. People wanted accountability. Families wanted answers. And her former patients, many of them grown now, wanted justice for the woman who had comforted them through their darkest hours. But the truth was buried too deep, and the only voice left was hers. In shaky, heartbreaking ink on those ruined notebook pages, Evelyn Hart left behind more than just words. She left behind proof of fear, of strength, of a final cry for help. And though she died alone in that dark room, her story didn't end there. It echoed through every corridor of the hospital, through every headline, through every tear shed by those who remembered her. Because sometimes the scariest monsters aren't ghosts or shadows. They're the ones who smile at you during morning rounds and disappear when no one's looking. The moment the remains of Dr. Evelyn Hart were identified, everything changed. The Cincinnati Police Department reopened the case immediately. St. Agatha's Children's Hospital was placed under investigation, not for what it was now, but for what it had been 23 years earlier. News vans crowded outside the hospital gates, and social media was flooded with photos of Evelyn, her last known ID badge, and emotional tributes from patients she had once cared for. The public demanded answers. So did the families who trusted the hospital with their children's lives. Investigators turned to the archives. Records dating back to 1999, personnel logs, maintenance reports, internal memos, and employee files. It wasn't easy. The hospital had undergone several administrative overhauls over the past 2 decades, and many of the older records had either been digitized poorly, misplaced, or discarded entirely. Still, what they managed to recover was disturbing. Several key staff members from 1999 were already deceased. Others had moved out of state or retired quietly. One nurse, who had worked closely with Evelyn, was living in Oregon. When contacted, she admitted she always suspected something had been hidden. "I remember Evelyn," she said in a video interview. "She wasn't just smart. She paid attention. Too much, maybe. And she was the kind of person who couldn't ignore something once she saw it." She recalled a conversation just a week before Evelyn vanished. Evelyn had hinted that something was off about the way medications were being distributed. She mentioned missing doses, altered charts, and the sudden appearance of pharmaceutical reps who never signed in through the front. At the time, the nurse didn't think much of it. Now, she couldn't stop thinking about it. But one name kept surfacing again and again in those dusty logs: Gerald L. Price, former head of hospital security. According to his personnel file, Price was a decorated veteran, hired in 1994 after retiring from military service. He had no disciplinary history on paper, but something strange caught the attention of the team reviewing records. Gerald Price resigned suddenly on May 30th, 1999, exactly 13 days after Hart disappeared. No explanation, no incident report, no formal exit interview, just a signed resignation letter and a brief note from the hospital director thanking him for his years of service. There were no records of him being questioned at the time of Evelyn's disappearance. He had simply left. Further inquiry revealed that Price passed away in 2017 from natural causes in a small town in Kentucky. He had never spoken publicly about the hospital or Dr. Hart, but his name appeared one more time, in a long-forgotten internal email thread uncovered by the IT forensics team. It was dated May 12, 1999, just 5 days before Evelyn vanished. In the email, a hospital administrator mentioned that Dr. Hart has submitted a formal complaint concerning possible tampering of pediatric patient records and the unauthorized presence of non-approved medication vials. The administrator had asked that the matter be handled quietly and referred to appropriate parties. That phrase stuck with investigators. Handled quietly. It was just vague enough to mean anything or everything. Further digging led to a second memo. This one hand-typed and filed in a locked records cabinet in the basement storage facility. It was written by Evelyn herself, addressed to the Ethics Review Board. It never made it to the board. It detailed specific concerns about a series of children in the cancer wing receiving experimental injections, with no parent consent forms on file. Evelyn noted that one child had suffered an unexplained seizure shortly after a treatment round. She had included photocopies of 2 patient charts and requested that the board investigate what she called a systemic ethical breach. The memo was dated May 16, 1999. She disappeared the next day. There were no responses, no follow-ups, no acknowledgement of receipt. The original charts she copied had been replaced in the official system. No mention of the injections remained. It was as if her concern never existed. The implication was terrifying. Had Evelyn uncovered a secret testing program? Was someone inside the hospital conducting unauthorized medical trials on sick children? And when Evelyn tried to report it, was she silenced? Authorities wouldn't say publicly. Too much time had passed. Too many records had vanished. But internally, the task force shared a chilling consensus. Dr. Evelyn Hart did not lock herself in that room. Someone else did. And whoever did it knew that part of the hospital like the back of their hand. They knew which doors were connected, which halls were under renovation, which cameras were down. They knew how to seal off that corridor and how to make sure no one would stumble onto it for decades. The deeper investigators went, the more dead ends they found. Files that should have existed were gone. Names that had once appeared on employment rosters now returned 0 results. Even the blueprints for the hospital's lower levels didn't show the bricked-off hallway where Evelyn was found. But Evelyn's notes were still here. And they told the real story. A woman who loved her job. A doctor who cared deeply for her patients. And a whistleblower who may have died trying to protect the very children she was hired to save. In the final analysis, the coroner confirmed that she likely died of dehydration within 5 days of confinement. It was slow, cruel, isolating. Her last known action was writing in that tiny notebook. They locked me in. I heard them outside, but no one came. It wasn't a resignation to fate. It was a record, a warning, a cry for help not just for her, but for the truth she tried to expose. And now, decades later, the world was finally listening. Her story became national news. Investigative journalists descended on St. Agatha's. Activists demanded reform in hospital accountability. Former patients held candlelight vigils outside the hospital gates. But most of all, people remembered Evelyn Hart, not as a victim, but as a fighter. A quiet hero who wouldn't let darkness go unchallenged, even if it cost her everything. In March 2023, nearly 24 years after she walked into St. Agatha's Children's Hospital and never came out, Dr. Evelyn Hart was finally given the memorial she deserved. The weather that day was bright, unusually warm for Cincinnati in early spring, almost like the sky had cleared just for her. The ceremony took place on the hospital lawn, near the newly constructed pediatric wing. Rows of white folding chairs lined the grass. A soft breeze rustled through the cherry blossoms nearby as families, hospital staff, city officials, and former patients gathered to remember the woman whose dedication had touched so many lives, and whose death had left an unhealed wound in the community. There were more people than anyone expected. Over 400. Some had driven from out of state just to attend. Others brought their children. Children who had once been patients of Dr. Hart, now grown adults with lives and families of their own. They carried photos, artwork, small mementos. Some wore pins with Evelyn's face on them, while others held candles with her initials etched into the glass. At the center of it all stood a large canvas photograph of Evelyn, placed on an easel beside the podium. In the photo, she smiled softly, arms folded in her lab coat, a stethoscope draped around her neck. Her eyes, gentle and intelligent, looked as if they could still see every person standing there. Beneath the photograph, engraved in bronze on a black stone plaque, were the words, "In memory of a healer silenced, but never forgotten." The moment those words were read aloud, you could feel the collective weight in the air, the deep exhale of grief that had been held too long. People cried, people hugged, and one after another, they stepped up to speak. A woman who had been Evelyn's patient at age 11 recalled how Hart used to bring her sticker books and paint sets after her chemotherapy sessions, even though that wasn't in her job description. A nurse from the 1990s shared how Evelyn had covered her shift once so she could attend her child's recital. A father who had lost his daughter to leukemia said Evelyn made them feel less alone in their darkest hour. But it wasn't just a day for mourning. It was a day for making sure her voice, silenced for so long, would now echo in something greater. That same day, St. Agatha's Children's Hospital unveiled a new policy program, the Hart Initiative. It was designed to protect whistleblowers within the medical system. Nurses, doctors, lab technicians, anyone who noticed irregularities or unethical behavior. It offered a direct, anonymous reporting line to an independent medical ethics board, legal protection from internal retaliation, and quarterly transparency audits. Hospital staff would receive formal training on ethics and reporting procedures, something that had been missing back in 1999. The initiative was more than just paperwork. It was a promise that no one like Evelyn would ever be left to die behind a locked door for doing the right thing. Her story shook the healthcare community far beyond Cincinnati. Medical journals ran feature articles about the dangers of silencing whistleblowers. National hospital associations adopted new standards for internal investigations. Even lawmakers cited Evelyn's case when drafting reforms for healthcare employee protections. But for those closest to her, her colleagues, friends, and especially her former patients, the grief still lingered, because there were still unanswered questions. To this day, no one knows exactly who sealed that basement room shut. No fingerprints, no surveillance, no confession. The man once suspected, the former head of security, died in 2017, taking whatever secrets he may have held to the grave. Some believed he acted alone. Others suspected he was just a pawn in something bigger, perhaps even part of an unspoken agreement to hide dangerous truths about what was happening inside that pediatric wing. But no formal charges were ever brought against anyone. There were no arrests, no apologies, only shadows. The bricked-up hallway where Evelyn was found has since been demolished. In its place stands a quiet courtyard. There's a single tree planted in the center, a weeping cherry blossom that blooms each spring. Beneath it is a simple bench with Evelyn's name carved along the side. Sometimes, hospital staff find flowers there, not store-bought ones, but wildflowers tied with string or ribbon, often placed by former patients or those who never even knew her, but feel connected to the story nonetheless. Because Evelyn's story isn't just about one person. It's about all the people in hospitals, schools, workplaces, everywhere, who see something wrong and try to speak up, who risk their careers, their reputations, sometimes even their lives, to do what's right. Her story is a reminder that silence can be deadly, but courage leaves a legacy. And as haunting as the mystery remains, her life now stands for something bigger. For integrity, for compassion, for the children she cared for, and the truth she died trying to protect. Even after all this time, her absence is felt, but so is her presence. You can see it in the mural painted on the wall of the children's wing, showing her surrounded by smiling kids. You can hear it in the way new nurses are trained to look beyond numbers and charts, to see the child, not just the illness. You can feel it in the quiet strength of those who keep asking questions, who refuse to look away. Because Evelyn Hart didn't just vanish. She was taken from the world far too early. But she left behind something no locked door could bury. Her name, her fight, her light, and her story, now told to millions, remains a chilling reminder. Sometimes, the places meant to heal us are the ones hiding the deepest wounds.